Have you ever wondered why some countries are rich and others are poor? Or why some global conflicts seem to have roots that go back centuries? A huge part of the answer lies in one of the most transformative and often brutal periods in human history, European colonialism. For roughly 500 years, from the late 15th century to the mid-20th, a handful of European nations extended their power across the globe, reshaping continents, redrawing maps, and forever altering the destinies of billions. This wasn't just about planting flags. It was a profound and often violent restructuring of the world. So, how did it all start? And what are the echoes of this era that we still hear today? Let's dive in. Our story begins in what's often called the Age of Discovery. Driven by a potent mix of economic ambition, religious zeal, and national rivalry, often summarized as gold, God, and glory, European powers like Portugal and Spain set sail. They were looking for new trade routes to the spices and silks of Asia, hoping to bypass the old land routes controlled by rival empires. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, sponsored by Spain, accidentally stumbled upon the Americas, opening up to new worlds for European exploitation. A few years later, Vasco da Gama of Portugal successfully sailed around Africa to reach India. These voyages were incredible navigational feats, but they also marked the beginning of a relentless wave of conquest and colonization. In the Americas, the arrival of Europeans was catastrophic for the indigenous populations. Empires like the Aztec and the Inca, with their sophisticated societies and vast cities, were toppled with shocking speed. This was accomplished through a combination of superior military technology, like guns and steel swords, strategic alliances with rival local groups, and, most devastatingly, disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity, wiped out an estimated 90% of the population in some areas. This demographic collapse made it far easier for colonizers to seize land and resources. The wealth extracted silver from Potosi, gold from across the continent flowed back to Europe, fueling its economic expansion and funding further colonial ventures. As the colonies in the Americas grew, the demand for labor skyrocketed, particularly for the back-breaking work on sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations. The solution the colonizers came up with was the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. Over the course of centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forcibly captured, chained, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in horrific conditions. They were treated not as human beings, but as property, their labor building the wealth of empires while their own communities were torn apart. This system of chattel slavery not only caused immense suffering, but also entrenched racist ideologies that were used to justify this inhumanity ideas that have cast a long and painful shadow. That persists to this day. Meanwhile, a different model of colonialism was taking shape in Asia and Africa, instead of the mass settlement seen in the Americas. European powers often established trading posts and gradually extended their political control. In India, the British East India Company initially a trading corporation, cleverly exploited local rivalries between princes and kingdoms. Through a mix of diplomacy, manipulation, and military force, it eventually brought the entire subcontinent under its control, turning the jewel in the crown of the British Empire into a vast source of raw materials and a captive market for British goods. This process deindustrialized India's once thriving textile industry to eliminate competition, a pattern repeated in many other colonies. The late 19th century saw the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European leaders literally sat down with a map and carved up the African continent among themselves, with zero regard for the existing ethnic, linguistic, or political boundaries. They drew straight lines on a map, lumping together rival groups and splitting coherent societies. The primary goal was resource extraction: rubber in the Congo, diamonds in South Africa, cocoa in West Africa. The rule was often brutal. King Leopold II of Belgium's personal rule over the Congo Free State is a horrifying example, where millions died under a forced labor system designed purely to extract rubber and ivory. This arbitrary division of the continent laid the groundwork for many of the civil wars and political instability that have plagued post-independence Africa. The legacy of this colonial era is complex and deeply embedded in the modern world. Let's start with the economy. The global economic system we have today was largely built on colonial foundations. A pattern was established where colonies served as suppliers of cheap raw materials, which were shipped to the colonizing countries, manufactured into finished goods, and then often sold back to the colonies at a profit. This created a global division of labor that concentrated wealth and industrial power in Europe and North America, while leaving many former colonies dependent on exporting a few raw commodities, making their economies vulnerable to global price swings. This is a major reason for the persistent wealth gap between the global North and the global South. Politically, the impact is just as profound. Those arbitrary borders drawn by colonizers became the national boundaries of newly independent states. This has been a source of endless tension. In many countries, the state itself is a colonial creation, and the challenge of building a unified national identity out of diverse groups who were previously rivals or had little to do with each other is immense. Furthermore, colonial powers often favored certain ethnic or religious groups over others, granting them positions in the colonial administration. This divide and rule strategy created deep-seated resentments that often exploded into conflict. After independence, as seen in the Rwandan genocide and countless other civil wars, culturally, colonialism imposed European languages, religions, and social norms, often suppressing or devaluing indigenous cultures. While this has led to a fascinating fusion of cultures in many places, it also resulted in a loss of cultural heritage and a sense of identity crisis. The education systems left behind by colonizers often taught a European version of history, glorifying the colonizers and ignoring the rich history of the colonized people themselves. Reclaiming and celebrating pre-colonial history and culture is a crucial part of the decolonization process that continues today. The psychological impact, sometimes called a colonial mentality, where the colonized internalize feelings of inferiority, is another subtle but powerful legacy. The fight for independence was a defining story of the 20th century. From Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent resistance movement in India to the armed struggles in Algeria, Kenya, and Vietnam, colonized peoples rose up to demand their freedom. The two world wars weakened the European powers, making it harder for them to maintain their overseas empires. A global shift in ideology, championed by the United States and the Soviet Union, also favored self-determination. By the 1970s, most former colonies had gained political independence. But as we've seen, political independence was only the first step. The struggle against the economic, political, and cultural legacies of colonialism, a process often called neocolonialism, continues. So, when we look at the world today, at global inequality, political conflicts, and debates over identity and reparations, we're seeing the long afterlife of colonialism. It's a history that is uncomfortable and complex, filled with both immense cruelty and unintended consequences. Understanding this past isn't about assigning blame, it's about recognizing the deep historical forces that have shaped our present. It helps us make sense of the world we live in and provides the context we need to work towards a more just and equitable future for everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a massive and important topic. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the history that shapes our world. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.